Welcome to Section 4 of the Renal Physiology Review. In Section 4, we'll go into more detail of the regulation of glomerular filtration, with an introduction to the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone axis and how this axis plays a role in the regulation of glomerular filtration. Welcome to Section 4 of the Renal Physiology Review, regulation of glomerular filtration. In this section, we will walk through regulation of GFR, focusing on regulation of glomerular capillary hydrostatic pressure. Glomerular capillary hydrostatic pressure is regulated through the processes of autoregulation through the myogenic response, as well as tubular glomerular feedback, and then we will walk through the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, which plays an extremely important role in the regulation of glomerular capillary hydrostatic pressure. The regulation of glomerular hydrostatic pressure depends on overall systemic arterial pressure, or overall renal perfusion, the afferent arteriolar resistance, and the efferent arteriolar resistance. Because the renal blood flow needs to pass through both arterioles, changes in the arterioles have parallel effects on renal blood flow, meaning dilation of either arteriole will increase renal blood flow, and constriction of either arteriole decreases renal blood flow. However, because the afferent arteriole controls glomerular inflow and the efferent arteriole controls glomerular outflow, changes in the arterioles have opposite effects on glomerular pressure. This is an extremely important concept to understand, and we'll walk through it in multiple ways. For the afferent arteriole, A comes before E, it is the inflow. If the afferent arteriole is dilated, glomerular capillary pressure increases. If the afferent arteriole is constricted, glomerular capillary hydrostatic pressure decreases. These move in parallel. However, the efferent arteriole, which is the outflow, has opposite effects. When the efferent arteriole is dilated, glomerular capillary hydrostatic pressure is decreased. When the efferent arteriole is constricted, glomerular capillary hydrostatic pressure is increased. Let's walk through a few examples. Here we have 5 images of the afferent arteriole, the efferent arteriole, and then the middle circle representing glomerular capillary hydrostatic pressure. The first image represents at baseline. If the afferent arteriole is dilated and there are no other changes, then both renal blood flow and glomerular capillary hydrostatic pressure increase. Ultimately then, GFR will also increase. However, if the afferent arteriole is constricted, then both renal blood flow and glomerular capillary hydrostatic pressure will fall. Ultimately, GFR will then also fall. The efferent arteriole behavior has the opposite effect. If the efferent arteriole is dilated, while renal blood flow goes up, the total glomerular capillary hydrostatic pressure goes down. GFR, which is ultimately dependent on glomerular capillary hydrostatic pressure, will also go down. If the efferent arteriole is constricted, the renal blood flow goes down. However, glomerular capillary hydrostatic pressure will go up, and ultimately GFR will also go up. One way to conceptualize this is to think of a garden hose connected to a faucet with millions of holes punched in the garden hose before the other end. Think of the mouth of the garden hose attached to the faucet as the afferent arteriole, and the mouth of the garden hose that is open on the other end as the efferent arteriole. If you dilate the afferent arteriole or turn the faucet higher, you'll notice the renal blood flow will go up, and the amount of water that passes through these million little holes, or the glomerular, which represents the glomerular capillary hydrostatic pressure, will also go up. You will have a similar effect, though, if you keep the afferent arterial tone, or the water faucet pressure, the same, and simply clamp off the distal end. When you would do that, then water, just like blood, is going to pass through the path of least resistance. In this case, it will be the million little holes that are punched in the length of the garden hose. This concept mirrors how changes in afferent or efferent arteriolar tone translate into changes in glomerular capillary hydrostatic pressure and ultimately GFR. And once again, it's important to remember, blood, just like any other fluid, travels down the path from high pressure to lowest pressure. If that lowest pressure is through the glomerular capillary bed, GFR goes up. However, that the lowest pressure is through the efferent arteriole, blood passes through the glomerular capillary bed, goes directly into the efferent arteriole, and GFR goes down. Once again, this is a basic but extremely important and tested over and over again concept. Let's move through this once again. Constriction of the afferent arterioles. This decreases renal blood flow, decreases glomerular hydrostatic pressure, and thus GFR. So therefore, the afferent arteriole is relatively straightforward. However, constriction of the efferent arteriole. If it is mild to moderate, there is increased glomerular hydrostatic pressure, which then increases GFR. This ability of the afferent arteriole to increase glomerular pressure is an important mechanism in the maintenance of GFR when systemic blood pressure, or afferent arteriolar blood flow, goes down. This serves as a compensatory mechanism to maintain GFR even when overall circulation is low. However, there is a limit to this. If the efferent arterial constriction is marked, there is reduced renal blood flow and increased glomerular capillary oncotic pressure. Ultimately, GFR will fall. This is because as the efferent arterial tone gets higher and higher, while initially GFR will go up, because of the plasma proteins and blood cells that are still present, ultimately there is a limit to how much GFR can increase before glomerular capillary oncotic pressure reaches a limit where it will, at any higher, then oppose further filtration. While we have been focusing on the pressure in the capillary beds, systemic arterial pressure also plays a role in GFR, as systemic arterial pressure will increase renal perfusion and increase glomerular hydrostatic pressure. Increased glomerular hydrostatic pressure then leads to increased GFR. However, mechanisms are in place, the autoregulation mechanisms, that protect the nephron from drastic swings in systemic blood pressure. You can see here, this is when then the arterial blood pressure range of approximately 60 to 160 millimeters of mercury. Outside this range, the renal blood pressure will match systemic blood pressure. However, within this range, the renal circulation tone will change to maintain pressure at a relatively fixed level. This ability of the kidney to autoregulate is somewhat dependent on the health of the total body vasculature. As individuals get older, or with more vascular disease, this autoregulation range can become more and more narrow, where smaller changes in arterial blood pressure can lead to true changes in GFR. The purpose of autoregulation is to ensure that renal blood flow and GFR remain relatively constant, even while systemic arterial pressures may fluctuate. Autoregulation is dependent primarily on two mechanisms: the myogenic response and tubular glomerular feedback. While it's not necessarily important to know the details of the myogenic response and tubular glomerular feedback, it is important to remember that autoregulation exists and the purpose of autoregulation, to maintain renal blood flow and GFR at a constant rate. The myogenic response. This is a response to increased afferent arteriolar pressure. This stimulates reflective vasoconstriction by stimulating smooth muscle cell contraction. The effect of this is to minimize the increase in glomerular capillary hydrostatic pressure that otherwise occur in response to increased systemic arterial pressure. This prevents damage to the glomerular capillaries, which already function at hydrostatic pressures that are much greater than those in the systemic capillary bed. The converse occurs when there is decreased afferent arteriolar pressure. There is a reflexive vasodilatation by stimulating vascular smooth muscle relaxation. This increases blood flow and filtration pressure in the glomerulus, thereby helping maintain GFR. The myogenic response is primarily a property of the smooth muscle cells of the afferent arteriole. There are multiple mediators of the myogenic response. One of importance is nitric oxide. The others are not as well elucidated, but it is important to remember that nitric oxide serves as a free radical scavenger. When there is free radical-induced injury to the renal circulation, nitric oxide is taken up, and the autoregulatory function of the afferent arteriole is impaired. The other mechanism of autoregulation is through tubular glomerular feedback. This is where the segment of the tubules that we outlined before, the macula densa, comes into play. Once glomerular filtration occurs, one of the primary electrolytes present in the urinary filtrate is chloride. Chloride delivery to the distal nephron will influence renal blood flow and GFR via the macula densa. The macula densa has three components: a signal, chloride delivery to the distal tubule into the sensor within the macula densa, which happens to be the sodium-potassium 2-chloride cotransporter, the same cotransporter present in the thick ascending loop of Henle. The last component is an effector, vascular smooth muscle cells within the wall of the afferent arteriole. When there is increased GFR, there is increased sodium chloride filtered, then sodium chloride delivered through the renal tubules into the macula densa. The high chloride concentration is sensed by the macula densa. This is an indication that GFR is very high. The reaction is to cause afferent arteriolar vasoconstriction. This afferent arteriolar vasoconstriction leads to reduced renal plasma flow as well as GFR, and then reduces sodium chloride delivery to the macula densa. The macula densa serves as a sort of gatekeeper to the urinary filtrate to prevent GFR from continuing at a very high rate. The mediator of the signal from the macula densa to the afferent arteriole is thought to be adenosine, which serves as a direct vasoconstrictor to the afferent arteriole. There are two important clinical implications of tubular glomerular feedback. One is that loop diuretics can blunt tubular glomerular feedback. As we said, the channel that senses the chloride is the sodium-potassium 2-chloride cotransporter. This is the same transporter that loop diuretics act on. Loop diuretics can thus block the channels that let the macula densa cells detect chloride, thus blunting the tubular glomerular feedback system. The other, perhaps more important relevance of tubular glomerular feedback is in the setting of acute tubular necrosis. Acute tubular necrosis occurs for a variety of reasons, but ultimately ends up causing renal tubular dysfunction. One of the primary components of renal tubular dysfunction is the inability to reabsorb salt, water, and other electrolytes and important substances in the proximal tubule. Outside of autoregulation, the neurohumoral system of the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system plays a primary importance in the regulation of GFR. When renal blood flow falls, this is detected by not only the macula densa, but also the juxtaglomerular apparatus. The juxtaglomerular apparatus is responsible for the synthesis and secretion of renin. Renin cleaves the circulating inactive peptide, angiotensinogen, converting it to angiotensin 1. Angiotensin 1 is converted to angiotensin 2 by angiotensin-converting enzyme on endothelial surfaces in the lung as well as in the kidney itself. Angiotensin 2 stimulates sodium retention, which allows for plasma volume expansion. This does this directly by increasing proximal tubular reabsorption, as well as indirectly by stimulating aldosterone synthesis and release, which promotes increased sodium and water reabsorption in the collecting duct. Angiotensin 2 also directly stimulates systemic vasoconstriction, which increases blood pressure. This system is extremely important for you to remember and to understand. Walking through this process, you can see that the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system provides a protection to reduce renal blood flow to stimulate increased reabsorption, increase in plasma volume, and increase in systemic blood pressure. Let's walk through this from a different viewpoint. Once again, low renal blood flow is sensed by the juxtaglomerular apparatus. The juxtaglomerular apparatus, or the JGA, is responsible for the synthesis and then secretion of renin. Renin cleaves the inactive enzyme form of the liver angiotensinogen into angiotensin 1. Angiotensin 1 is now free through the circulation. Angiotensin 1 can be converted to the active form, angiotensin 2, by angiotensin-converting enzyme. Angiotensin-converting enzyme is present in the lung as well as in the kidney itself. The effects are multiple. One, angiotensin 2 stimulates reabsorption of sodium and then therefore water in the proximal tubule. It also stimulates the synthesis and secretion of aldosterone from the adrenal gland. Aldosterone has effect in the collecting duct to increase sodium reabsorption. Angiotensin 2 also causes direct vasoconstriction, both of the systemic as well as the renal circulation. Finally, angiotensin 2 stimulates the pituitary gland to secrete ADH. ADH will then promote further water reabsorption in the collecting duct. We will walk through this concept in more detail with regard to the tubular reabsorption of sodium and water, but it is important to remember that sodium is osmotically active. In the segments of the kidney that are permeable to water, whenever sodium is reabsorbed, water is also reabsorbed. This is the kidneys as well as the body's way of maintaining circulating volume. Let's review the key functions of angiotensin 2. The direct effects. It is a potent vasoconstrictor that helps maintain blood pressure. It is perhaps the single most potent endogenous vasoconstrictor. While it has a vasoconstrictive effect both in the systemic and the renal circulation, it has a preferential effect in the efferent arteriole, which then will lead to increased GFR. It also directly promotes sodium and water reabsorption in the proximal tubule. The indirect effects are that it stimulates two mechanisms to promote salt and water reabsorption. First, it stimulates aldosterone, a potent mineralocorticoid, released from the adrenal cortex. Aldosterone stimulates sodium and water reabsorption in the distal tubule, as well as potassium secretion. It also stimulates ADH release from the posterior pituitary. This allows for increased free water reabsorption in the cortical collecting duct. Let's walk through the afferent and efferent arterioles once again, this time including the effects of angiotensin II and how it is important in maintaining GFR. When there is decreased blood pressure, there is constriction of the afferent arteriole. Renal blood flow falls, glomerular capillary hydrostatic pressure falls, and GFR falls. Shown in this slide are two potent mediators of this vasoconstriction, norepinephrine and epinephrine. The afferent arteriole is similar to other arterioles in the body. It's acted upon the same vasoactive substances that act upon the systemic arterioles. The afferent arteriole is relatively insensitive to angiotensin II. At lower concentrations, angiotensin II has minimal effect on the afferent arteriole, acting primarily on the efferent arteriole alone. Moving on to the efferent arteriole. In the setting of mild to moderate drop in renal blood flow, we said while there is afferent arteriolar vasoconstriction from substances such as norepinephrine and epinephrine, angiotensin II is also being released. Angiotensin II has a relatively select effect of constricting the efferent arteriole. This helps increase glomerular capillary hydrostatic pressure, thus increasing and preserving GFR even in the setting of decreased renal blood flow. Along with the autoregulatory mechanisms that help maintain renal blood flow, angiotensin II and the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system is central to the kidney's ability to maintain GFR despite drops in renal perfusion pressure. This becomes extremely clinically important in the setting of medications that are given that may prevent the conversion of angiotensin I to angiotensin II, this is ACE inhibitors, or prevent the activity of angiotensin II directly, or angiotensin receptor blockers. When these medications are present, they will inhibit the effects of angiotensin II, both in the systemic but also in the renal circulation. Therefore, the compensatory mechanisms that are in place to increase GFR in the setting of decreased renal blood flow will not be as active, and GFR will fall in a more pronounced fashion. With high levels of angiotensin, vasoconstriction occurs in both arterioles, both the afferent and the efferent arteriole. This is exemplified by the renal circulation in the setting of sepsis or any other state of shock. Severe decreases in blood pressure, although there are marked elevations in angiotensin II and other vasoconstrictors, this leads to marked vasoconstriction of both the afferent and efferent arterioles, and there's a marked drop in renal blood flow, glomerular capillary hydrostatic pressure, and GFR. So while angiotensin II at low to moderate concentrations allows for the preservation of GFR, this compensatory mechanism too can be overwhelmed. Let's go through another question. Which of the following abnormalities in isolation is most likely to reflect damage specifically to the renal glomeruli? A. Hypertension, B. Hematuria, C. Pyuria, or D. Proteinuria. The correct answer is D. Proteinuria. While any of these abnormalities can reflect damage to the glomeruli, hypertension, hematuria, pyuria, or proteinuria, proteinuria is the only abnormality that can occur only with damage to the glomeruli. Hematuria or pyuria can occur with damage to any part of the urinary collecting system even beyond the kidney. Hypertension does not necessarily reflect damage to the renal glomeruli, but may reflect salt. Question 3. Which of the following will inhibit the release of renin from the juxtaglomerular apparatus? A. Stimulation of the macula densa. B. Increase in pressure within the afferent arterioles. C. Beta-adrenergic agonists. D. Prostaglandins. Or E. Aldosterone. The correct answer is B. An increased pressure within the afferent arterioles. Once again, renin is released in response to decreased renal blood flow. Therefore, an increase in pressure or an increase in renal blood flow will inhibit the release of renin. Question number 4. Which of the following would most likely cause an increase in glomerular filtration rate? A. Release of renin from the juxtaglomerular apparatus. B. Contraction of the mesangial cells. C. Dilation of the afferent arterioles. D. Volume depletion. Or E. Obstruction to both ureters. The correct answer is C. Dilation of the afferent arterioles. Dilation of the afferent arterioles will increase glomerular capillary hydrostatic pressure. This will most reliably increase glomerular filtration rate. While release of renin, one would suspect, would potentially increase GFR, depending on the degree of renin release and thus the degree of angiotensin II activity, GFR initially, while it may increase. Question number 5. A 55-year-old woman with rheumatoid arthritis who is taking ibuprofen is diagnosed with a nephrotic syndrome after workup for lower extremity edema reveals large amounts of protein in her urine. Although the forces promoting filtration across the glomerulus are altered in this patient, which of the following Starling forces is directly altered as a result of this disease? A. Plasma oncotic pressure. B. Hydrostatic pressure in Bowman space. C. Oncotic pressure in Bowman space. Or D. Plasma hydrostatic pressure. As we mentioned before, ibuprofen, a non-steroidal, is associated with the development of minimal change disease, especially in adults. In minimal change disease, the normal charge barrier in the glomerular basal membrane is lost, and albumin filters across the basal membrane into Bowman space. Therefore, oncotic pressure in Bowman space increases and alters the Starling forces. Remember, oncotic pressure in Bowman space normally is essentially zero. So in the setting of someone with albumin loss into Bowman space, this has a marked effect on increasing oncotic pressure. This concludes Section 4 of the Renal Physiology Review. The key points to remember from Section 4 are that glomerular filtration is highly regulated, both by autoregulation as well as through the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. These two systems work in concert to regulate glomerular filtration.